Part 2. Why transfer happens, and when it turns against us. In Part 1, we established that transfer is real, that it runs in 3 directions, and that we judge it by the target situation. But we deliberately left a bigger question hanging. Why? Why does practicing one thing make another thing easier or harder? That why is the heart of Part 2, and it matters enormously in practice, because if you understand the mechanism, you understand what a learner is actually acquiring when they practice, and therefore how to design practice that transfers. We'll tackle it in 2 movements. First, the bright side, the 2 dominant theories of positive transfer. Both agree the engine is similarity between situations, but they disagree about which kind of similarity counts. Similarity of the visible components, the movements and the setting, versus similarity of the underlying cognitive processing, the kind of thinking the task demands. That distinction is subtle, genuinely important, and a favorite of exam writers, so we'll spend real time on it. Then we'll cross to the dark side and study negative transfer in depth, its precise definition, the 2 specific situations that trigger it, the 3 psychological reasons it happens, and the reassuring fact that it's both rare and temporary. By the end of Part 2, you'll be able to explain not just that transfer occurs, but why. And you'll know how to spot the conditions that can turn a learner's own experience against them, and how to coach them through it without losing their confidence. Let's start with why positive transfer happens at all.
So why does positive transfer happen at all? This is where the concept earns its theoretical keep, because if we understand the mechanism, we understand what a person actually learns about a skill. Researchers have floated several explanations over the decades, but 2 dominate the field. And here's the good news that makes them easy to hold together. They agree completely on the headline. Both say the answer is similarity between the 2 situations. Picture the figure from your text. 2 overlapping circles, skill A and skill B. The more they overlap, the more transfer you get. Pull them apart, and transfer shrinks towards 0. Where the 2 theories part ways is on which kind of similarity matters most, what exactly those overlapping regions are made of. The first theory says it's about similar components, the actual concrete parts, the movements you make and the setting you make them in. The second says it's about similar processing, the kind of thinking and information handling the skill demands of your brain. Those are genuinely different claims, and they lead to different predictions and different practice designs, so it's worth taking them one at a time. Each also carries a twist that complicates the tidy, more overlap, more transfer picture in an instructive way. Let's start with the older, more intuitive of the 2, the components view, and then see how the processing view fixes what it misses.
The first hypothesis is the older, more intuitive one, and it traces all the way back to E.L. Thorndike at Columbia University in the early 1900s, his identical elements theory. The idea? The more 2 skills or 2 contexts share component parts, the more positive transfer between them. So, on a components view, you'd predict more transfer from the tennis serve to the volleyball serve than to the racquetball serve, because the tennis and volleyball serves share more movement parts. And context counts too. A rehab protocol that has the patient practice walking in their actual home environment will transfer better than one that stays locked inside the clinic. Now, here's a subtlety worth knowing. A component isn't always obvious to the eye. O'Keefe and colleagues found that practicing fundamental overarm throwing transferred to both the badminton overhead clear and the javelin throw. But Bernstein added a deeper twist that I love. He argued it's not the surface kinematics, how the movement looks, that drive transfer, but the underlying background corrections, the deep control demands. His examples are vivid. Violin bowing looks a lot like sawing wood or filing metal, yet he expected almost no transfer among them because the forces involved are completely different. Meanwhile, cycling and ice skating look nothing alike, yet he expected real transfer between them because both come down to one deep demand: maintaining dynamic balance on a very narrow base of support. Same hidden challenge, even with utterly different looking movements. It's a standing reminder to look past appearances and ask what the body is actually regulating underneath.
The second hypothesis goes by the name transfer-appropriate processing, and it captures something the components view can miss.
Here, what transfers isn't the movement at all, it's the kind of thinking the skill requires. The claim? If your target task demands rapid decision-making, problem-solving, applying rules, controlling attention, or doing two things at once, then your practice has to demand those same cognitive processes, or the transfer won't be there when it counts. And here's the genuinely surprising part the authors stress. The training task and the transfer task do not need similar movements at all. Two skills that look completely unalike can transfer beautifully if they tax the brain the same way. Two that look nearly identical may not if the thinking behind them differs. This is precisely why, as we said back in part 1, you can only honestly judge a practice method by watching performance in the real test context, because it's often the processing demands, not the surface movements, that decide whether transfer happens. To be fair about the state of the science, though, both hypotheses have real merit. The processing view is best understood as an extension of the components view, rather than a rival, and as Schmidt and Young concluded in their major review, we still don't fully understand everything that accounts for transfer. It remains an open, under-researched question, which I'd argue makes it more interesting, not less, and leaves room for the next generation of researchers, maybe some of you, to push it forward.
Now let's flip to the dark side, negative transfer, the case where prior learning actively fights the new skill instead of helping it. Here's the precise definition, and get it exactly right because it's a classic exam question. Negative transfer happens when a familiar stimulus requires a different response. Unpack that. The environmental context, the situation, the cues, the layout, feels the same as something you already know well, but now the movement has to change. That specific combination is the whole trap. Because the situation looks and feels familiar, your motor system automatically reaches for the old, well-grooved response, the very response that now gets in the way of the new one you're actually trying to produce. Notice the irony at the center of it. The familiarity is exactly what makes it hard. If everything about the situation were brand new, there'd be no entrenched habit lying in wait to interfere in the first place. You'd just be learning from scratch. So negative transfer is, in a sense, a problem of success. You learned the first thing so well that it now intrudes on the second. Keep that definition crisp. Familiar stimulus, different response. Because the next two slides are essentially a guided tour of where that collision shows up, why it happens in the brain and body, and the good news about how reliably it clears. Two situations are especially prone to negative transfer, and they're worth flagging for any learner so they see it coming. The first is a spatial location change. Think about driving an unfamiliar car. Everything is roughly where you expected, just subtly shifted. There's even a documented tragic version of this called unintended acceleration, where drivers press the gas instead of the brake because the pedal positions differ slightly from their own car. Or drive on the opposite side of the road, where the shifter, the mirror, and the indicator all swap sides, and you'll flick the wipers when you meant to signal a turn, exactly the moment we opened the chapter with. Familiar cues, but they now demand different movements. The second danger zone is a timing structure change. The textbook's example is the freestyle swimmer's 6-beat kick, 6 kicks for every 2 arm strokes. Swimmers who first learned a comfortable 2 or 4-beat kick really struggle to adopt the 6-beat version. The old rhythm keeps reasserting itself, sometimes for quite a while. A related case is the bimanual coordination study by Lee, Swinen, and Verschuren. People learning a new asymmetrical arm pattern kept snapping back to their natural symmetrical one. Both situations share the same signature, a familiar setting that now requires you to move on a different schedule or in a different place. Spot either one in your learners, and you can predict and preempt the rough patch coming.
So why does negative transfer actually happen? The authors give 3 reasons, and because this maps directly to a study question, let's be crisp about each. First, memory, a specific perception-action coupling. Performing a skill one way builds a tight, almost automatic link between what you perceive and how you move. When that familiar situation appears, the motor system organizes itself the preferred, learned way, and consciously overriding it is genuinely hard. Second, cognitive confusion. Sometimes you're simply not sure what to do in a familiar but changed setting. Think of typing on a keyboard where the backspace key has moved.
Your fingers know how to type perfectly well. It's the confusion about the new layout that slows you. The problem there is cognitive, not in your limb control. Third, competing dynamics. From the dynamical systems view, your existing coordination tendencies, your intrinsic dynamics, can compete with the pattern the new task requires, and that competition makes the new learning harder. There's a fascinating wrinkle here the authors call retroactive negative transfer. Learning a brand new pattern can actually destabilize an old, previously stable one. The best illustration is infants learning to walk. Corbetta and Boychik showed they temporarily regress from one-handed back to two-handed reaching, and other work showed their sitting gets briefly disrupted as the whole system reorganizes itself around the new skill of walking. So negative transfer isn't one thing. It's a family of collisions in memory, in cognition, and in the deep dynamics of coordination.
And here's the genuinely reassuring part, so nobody panics the moment they hit it. Negative transfer is real, but it is rare, and it is almost always temporary. It bites mainly in the early stage of learning, and then fades steadily with practice. You'll see it most clearly when someone has to unlearn an old way of doing something. The high school athlete who reaches college and has to retool a once successful technique for a higher level. Or the stroke survivor who, months out, has settled into a compensatory gait that overloads the good leg and now has to learn a healthier, more symmetrical pattern. In both cases, performance dips at first, then climbs as the new way takes hold and the old interference washes out. So your job as a practitioner is really threefold. First, warn learners it's coming. Tell them plainly that early clumsiness here is normal, expected, and a sign of progress, not failure. Second, give the specific trouble spots extra instructional attention, since that's where the old habit fights hardest. And third, maybe most important of all, don't let an early stumble crush their motivation. Because in practice, it's the discouragement, not the negative transfer itself, that makes people quit before the interference clears. Frame the dip honestly, and they'll push through it. Leave it unexplained, and they may conclude they're just not good at this and walk away right before it gets better. With patient practice, the interference resolves every time. Quick recap of Part 2, because it carried our two heaviest ideas. Positive transfer is explained by similarity, and it comes in two forms. Similarity of components is Thorndike's identical elements theory. Shared movements and shared settings, with Bernstein's reminder that the real components may be deep control demands, not surface looks. Similarity of processing is the transfer-appropriate processing view, shared cognitive demands. And remember its big surprise, the movements needn't match at all if the thinking does. On the other side, negative transfer is when a familiar stimulus requires a new response, and its two danger zones are spatial location changes and timing structure changes. It arises from three sources: locked-in perception-action couplings, plain cognitive confusion, and competing intrinsic dynamics. And it can even reach backward to destabilize an old skill. But carry out the headline that keeps it in perspective. Negative transfer is rare and temporary, an early-stage phenomenon that practice reliably overcomes. Understand why transfer happens, and you can engineer more of the good kind and disarm the bad kind. That's the practical payoff of Part 2, and it sets up the most surprising material of the whole chapter, waiting in Part 3.